So when trying to cross certain thresholds in training, like getting a first muscle up or hitting a certain weight on a snatch or finally being able to handstand walk, all these kinds of things, there's pretty frustrating point for people when they're on the cusp of being able to do something, right? Where they feel like they're just sort of beating their head against the wall, unable to actually cross that threshold of consistently being able to do muscle ups or hit a specific benchmark on a snatch, something like 225, where it's like, oh, there's 245-pound plates on the bar. Like this is the weight I need to be able to hit. And it can be challenging as a coach to kind of guide people through those points in training because they feel like they're just interminably stuck. They're never going to be able to actually cross that threshold. And something that can be somewhat confusing to communicate is the idea of just needing to take more shots on goal, right? Meaning just like, hey, you need more attempts at this and you're just going to figure it out. And for a lot of people, they think that there's some progression that they're missing, that they need to do some sort of, complicated skill work series to figure it out, that there's going to be some magic combination of doing snatch balances, on the minute that's going to result in them actually catching the weight that they've been pulling under repeatedly on the snatch and failing. And to be clear, right, sometimes there are situations where people just need to take a step back and do a bunch more skill work. But most of the time, they just really need more shots on goal, right? It's like, hey, listen, you're going to be successful at doing this movement something like 3% of the time. And if you try it 15 times in one session, you're probably not actually going to get it, right? Like you just need more attempts. And maybe that can't be in one session. We're talking about heavy snatching, just beating your head against the wall, snatching your 1 rep max, your desired 1 rep max over and over again and failing, not necessarily helpful, right? If you're trying to get a muscle up and your upper body pulling strength isn't, all the way there, just doing it over and over again and giving yourself elbow tendonitis or like an irritated shoulder, also not helpful. But that said, there is this concept of like, cool, if you're going to be successful at this 3% of the time and you only get a few attempts in here and there, like you're just going to feel like you're stuck forever. But if you just figure out a way to actually take more attempts at it, then you might suddenly be able to do the thing, which can then create positive momentum in training. And so as a coach, it's this tricky balance of giving people an opportunity to try things over and over again so they can just like have enough attempts that they have a realistic shot at being successful, with not letting them just do like dumb stuff that's going to cause frustration, injury, etc. And so, I don't have like a fantastic way for how to intuitively know like where someone is and what they should be doing with this. But I do know that this is something that I try to communicate to people, and sometimes they do find it helpful. So I guess I'm curious for you, Luke, like, what does this look like for you? Are you able to communicate this effectively to people? What do you see athletes struggling with when they're, on the cusp of a new level in training? What do you think?
Yeah, I think with technical movements, it can be quite difficult in a sort of remote setting because you don't necessarily, as much as someone can send you videos, sometimes you don't necessarily understand the sort of process going around that video, the sort of build up to it, also just like the amount of stress that might be within that one movement that the individual has. I mean, the sort of shots on goal idea is something that I think is it was how I learned a lot of skills. It was how I know a lot of it was probably how you learned a lot of skills. It was very much just going for movements and sort of failing and figuring it out and getting a bit of a hand and maybe getting a bit of help and figuring out an area where you need a little bit more work and sort of going around it in a bit more of a cumbersome way, but it was sort of effective in the sense that I feel like it allows you to acquire skills quite quickly if you have the time. And I remember back when I was starting out CrossFit, I was a student, so every spare hour I would be down the gym, fooling around to try and do handstand walks. But it was an effective way to do that. And now when people obviously have an understanding around the importance of programming, around the importance of progression, quite often people feel like there is like this combination that they need to unlock that is going to allow them to perform the skill, whether it's certain strength work they need to do, And I think that like with individuals who are sort of past that novice level and sort of coming across their sort of stumbling blocks within their training and these barriers, it's really important to understand that they're not going to be making that week to week progression that they once experienced, and that even if you do have this right combination of movements that you're going to be sort of putting together, you're probably just going to be faffing around and actually just struggling with it in the same way you are in week 4 that you were in week 1. You may sort of develop these connections and these sort of like breakthrough understandings within the movement. But maybe you're at this level for say 3 months and you go through 2 training blocks working on you getting this number, this skill, this number of repetitions unbroken, whatever it is. And it's not until you've completed sort of 3 months of frustrating work that you have this breakthrough performance. And then all of a sudden you're now in sort of like a new level, and now you are, you've sort of moved the goalpost forward a little bit more, and now you're operating within the new goal, and then you're frustrated again in this sort of new process. I think what is going to be key for people is trying to sort of create an environment whereby there's not necessarily too much stress around the movement. Maybe they have certain drills and skills that they do to sort of help them. Maybe this is something that they need to do. Maybe this is something they feel that they need to do. I think that's actually quite key. Is sometimes people feel that they need to do something, and honestly, it can't hurt, right? Like if someone is saying, I need to be quicker underneath the barbell, and they're trying to snatch 100 kilos, doing extra drop snatches at 40 kilos is probably going to actually help with the whole thing. It might not necessarily be the thing that they need to do, but if it builds up their confidence, maybe that's something that's actually going to be more effective than them going through the right percentage build over the course of a training block. So sometimes it's giving them what they what an athlete feels like they need to do. But at the same time, as we say sort of often on this podcast, is try not to play into people's craziness within their own training. So you've got to be careful there. But sort of trying to create an environment which allows them just to keep, keep on training that quality or that movement or that skill that they're trying to develop. Make sure that they're doing it in a way where they're not getting too aroused by it. And when I say aroused, I'm talking in the sort of sports psychology sense. So they're going in with a bit of a cool head, and they're able to get this practice done, and they're able to pack up at the end of the day and be fine with it. If it doesn't go their way, they're not writing some stoic blog post or Instagram post around failure and all this type of thing. And they're just they're able just to
things don't always go as planned.
Yeah, right. It's either the success or the failures post. But they're able to do that, and then they're able to sort of keep on going. And I think that could be giving someone 5 minutes of practice at the end of a session. It could be telling them to go to a gymnastics class or a weightlifting club or something like that once a week to work one-to-one with a coach if they have access to that. That can be something that can be quite effective, because you just say, immerse yourself in that, just get exposure, see what happens, let someone else take the lead, and let's see where you're at in 3 months. And, likelihood is that if they have hands-on coaching, they're going to actually be in a better spot than they were if they had that right combination of progressions or movements that they feel like they need to do. And I think that just trying to create that environment for consistent, productive work is going to be what is key for people to be able to go through this. And then once you do break through those movements, once you do you get more shots on goal and get what you want, you also have to understand that you're going to move those goalposts, and it's going to be something else. And you've got to try to, I think, if you can, when you're sort of in these early frustrations within your training career, you've got to try to sort of develop a bit of a process so that you're allowed to sort of, it allows you to cope through this and allows you to work through it in a real productive way, because this is always going to be something that's going on.
Yeah, I think that the idea of non-linearity and progression, I mean, we've talked about this several times on the podcast, but you started to mention that, and I think that's one of the most important things. It's also very challenging to communicate effectively, because I think for a lot of people in their training, they think of their progress like the progress of a video game character, like some Super Nintendo RPG, right? It's like in Final Fantasy. where it's like, okay, I've accumulated this much experience. I'm at this level now. I have this many hit points and I do this much damage with every time I, cast a certain spell or whatever. And in real life, things don't necessarily work that way. It's not just like, oh, I'm at this level now and this is what I can do, right? That it's much squigglier and much more, and there's a lot more variation.
Have you seen the World of Warcraft episode of South Park?
No.
Okay, all right. It was quite funny because they play World of Warcraft, and for them to get to a certain level, they do this really menial task in the game, which is like the equivalent of doing, I don't know, 10 air squats, say in the CrossFit world.
Yeah.
And they just spend months doing this one menial task to try to get to this level. But that, if there's any listeners out there who have watched that episode of South Park about World of Warcraft, that is shots on goal. That is literally just doing the most menial task possible to be able to get to a certain level. But yeah, sorry to ruin your computer game analogy there.
No, it's good. Although I think your analogy is almost like the opposite of mine, where I'm like, it's not like a video game character, right? You can't just like accumulate experience and then suddenly be at a new level, right? It's more complicated than that. So I think that what you're saying is in this analogy that they just like can do something simple and then acquire gold.
They created that environment which allows consistent productive work, and then they get to. That was sort of the point, but it's probably lost. We'll make sure in the show notes there's a South Park episode link because it's quite.
Yeah,
funny.
we can link to it. We can link to it, and then we can decide what the South Park episode actually says about training. But yeah, I mean, anyway, to kind of circle back to what I was saying, right? I mean, it's not as simple as like, oh, okay, I'm at this level now. Now I'm the type of person who can snatch 225 every time I go in the gym. I can do it, right? Now I can do muscle ups every time I hop on the rings. I can do it because people will have this experience where they maybe do have that breakthrough moment, right? That they've done enough training. They were in the right place at the right time. Things came together. They hit a big PR on a lift. They were able to handstand walk in a workout. They're able to get on top of the rings and press themselves out. It's very exciting, right? And then inevitably what happens, the next time they go in the gym is that they're not even close. They try to get on top of the rings and they're like, I can't do muscle ups anymore. What's wrong with me? Right? I'm never going to figure it out again. It was a fluke.
I've lost them. I've lost it. Literally lost them.
I've lost it.
They're gone. They're out the window.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And like this kind of catastrophizing, language surrounding your abilities. And, when we have this messy environment where there's a lot of day-to-day variation in training, we run into something that's called regression to the mean, which is very common in any sort of like statistical scenario, right? Where scientists, anyone who's actually dealing with like a lot of data has to just watch out for this concept, which is that like, okay, if you have a mean performance, meaning like an average typical thing that you can do, right? That if you say on any given day, what is my mean back squat, right? Like on average, what back squat am I going to be able to do if I max out? And that is your most likely outcome on that day if you were to max out your back squat. Some days it's going to be less, some days it's going to be more, but if you average it out over time, there's probably a number that you could get to, right? If you just like, tested your max back squat 3 days a week for a certain amount of time. And that's obviously has its own problems because it would probably get better just from you doing that. But for the sake of argument, let's say that you have a mean back squat. And then, on some days, if you squat significantly higher than your average, you are almost certainly going to squat less on your next session just because the particularly high session was an outlier, right? And so that return to a more average performance is called regression to the mean. And you see that all the time when someone has a particularly bad training session or a particularly good training session. Their next session is likely going to be closer to their normal output ability. And then people can interpret, this significant change in performance from day to day as like something that they did, right? Where it's like, oh, I was able to snatch 225 on this day. And then the next time I maxed my snatch, it was only 205 again. Like, what did I do wrong in between? And it's like, you did nothing wrong. It's just regression to the mean. The 225 was an outlier. Your average day, you're still going to snatch around 205, right? And then on the opposite end, people can have a bad day in training, right? Where they can't do any muscle ups or something. And then they're like, oh, I need to like figure out what's wrong with me. Like what's going on? I lost my muscle ups. I need to do all these shoulder exercises and band drills. And like, I need to figure it out. And then the next time they train, they can do a bunch of muscle ups again. And it's not like they did anything that special. It's just regression to the mean of like, you can usually do some muscle ups. You had a particularly bad day where you couldn't do any. And your next session, you're just probably going to be able to kind of do them again, right? So I think that people can get some really bad ideas about what works and what doesn't work by overreacting to outlier training sessions that are either particularly good or bad, and then interpreting things that they did as either causing this outlier or causing to return to where they were before. And in reality, it's just like, hey, your range of performance is much wider than you think it is. And you're probably mostly going to be somewhere in the middle. And you're occasionally going to be way outside of that. And it's not, you're not causing those significant changes. You're not causing that like big jump up or that return to where you were previously. It's just part of like a messy, noisy process. And so when communicating, especially about people who are on this threshold of being able to do something or not, you know, a lot of my communication just kind of circles back to just like, hey, like you're doing all right. You just need a bunch of attempts. You're going to figure it out. Some days it's there, some days it's not. And, you know, I don't know if that's always what people want to hear, but I do try to kind of like pull them back so that they just are able to, you know, train without this like, oh, is it this thing that caused that? Did this cause that? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's like the idea of that shots on goal. You know, it was something that you obviously when I was learning skills, it was something that I implemented just intuitively. It was something that I was like, okay, well, this is just sort of how you go about it. I didn't really know any better. Then I got into training for several years. You know, getting into more sort of structured strength and conditioning for CrossFit. And I remember when we started working together, I remember you just throwing in, 20 minutes of practice, and you just wrote down like 5 different movements. And I understand that as being this idea of like that practice play sort of scenario, shots on goal. And for me, it was like, I can remember, I think I asked you, I was like, okay, well, you know, how do I go about this? Because I was so used to there just being some measurables around it. And anyway, I now implement that into coaching a lot of my athletes. And for those people who are still playing around with movements, sometimes it's really difficult, like trying to find, especially in gymnastics, and this is sort of something that keeps coming up within gymnastics, is like trying to find the part of the movement which is difficult for them to perform. You know, if say for instance we're talking about a muscle up, maybe they need more shoulder extension so that they're more comfortable at the bottom of the dip and they're able to transition over the rings effectively. But that takes a long time to develop. That's not something that you can acquire really, really easily. And you also have so many other things pulling you in the other direction within CrossFit and potentially tightening you up. So, you know, you can work on that, but then you also do need to have these sort of periods of time where you are just trying to sort of set yourself up for success. One example of this sort of shots on goal is, you know, in gymnastics movements, having someone as like a spotter to sort of actually help you get a feel for the movement. You know, that's something that, you know, can be really quite effective, because sort of once you have this feel for the movement, that can potentially unlock this like aha moment of, oh, I need to do it this way. But what I find effective is, especially with beginners, is very much just like drills, get them into a position where they're developing good habits. And then from there, you're then creating a bit more freedom off the back end of that, so that you're allowing them to do sort of these 10-minute skill pieces or whatever it is, because they need to develop those habits in the first place. So when it comes down to, okay, I need to be doing, you know, snatch balances, tool snatches to get quicker underneath the bar. I need to do lots of empty bar work before I warm up, you know, or with the gymnastic side, maybe they need to be doing lots of kip swings and understanding how to sort of just find rhythm on the bar. This is something that can be quite effective with beginners, because it's just getting them into good habits. And then from there, you're then coaching them, because, you know, until they've sort of developed those habits, sometimes they're just making a different error every single rep. And it's like, okay, well, how do we hone this in? So you sort of want to create a bit of a base and establish that, and then allow people to then have the freedom off the back end. For people who are a little bit more experienced, sometimes having like a bit of a period, you know, every week, every 2 weeks, where they focus on the movement, they play around with it, It's like accumulate as many successful, clean looking reps, fast reps as you can within this time frame, and then just letting people sort of navigate that themselves. Most of the time, something like that, it gets turned into an EMOM, and then from there, it's like, okay, maybe don't turn it into an EMOM next time, or maybe this is a better way to turn it into an EMOM, or it's sometimes that process of just, so let's call it 3 weeks or whatever, and then at the end of that 3 weeks, you find a bit of a groove that creates that ability to like allow them to be able to have consistent work. One thing you were saying, just bringing it back to this regression to the mean, one thing you were sort of saying, it reminded me of a podcast. I'm not too sure if you, I, and John did this, or it was just you and John, but it was talking about that idea of your like average performance, how your average performance is what is really, really important. And if you can increase your average performance and like, over a period of time, this is going to be, you could potentially say more effective, or it's going to be indicating that you're in a better spot than you were previously compared to being better on your best day. And I suppose this regression to the mean concept links into that really, really well, where it's like if you can actually increase that mean, then you're in a spot where you were better than yesterday, or you were better than before.
Yeah, and I think that actually it's not just your average performance, but like the floor of your performance. What's the worst case scenario, right? Because I think that as people get better at most endurance sports, honestly, there was a really good article that Alex Hutchinson wrote about this recently, just covering some recent literature where, and I think this is something a lot of coaches sort of know intuitively, is that people who are really, really good can do a lot of stuff and then still have their performance be roughly similar, right? And this was, I think, done in cyclists, and they just had a power curve for like how much power they could sustain for different periods of time. And people who are elite cyclists, their power curve for like what they could sustain for different periods of time looked almost exactly the same, like after successive hard sessions, where it's just like you're continuing to do a bunch of really hard stuff and like your power curve is still basically the same. And for people who are sub-elite, right, that their power curve initially actually wasn't too far off from what the elites could do, but on each successive one, you could see it was like here, then it would drop, then it would drop, right? And we see that same thing with CrossFit athletes, where it's like, can you do, what's your max set of unbroken chest to bar pull-ups? Like, oh, that's pretty good. That's the same as some games athletes. Like, how many chest to bar pull-ups can you do after you do all this other shit on event 6 of the day? None. Oh, well, like that's the difference, right? And so, I think that improving the floor of someone's performance, both in terms of day-to-day variation and in terms of what they can do under worst case scenario, is like that's kind of the crux of getting better at this sport, right? And that's a little different than just like accumulating skills, but I do think that that's an important thing to understand as well when you're thinking about like the messy variation in performance. So, I mean, Luke, I guess one thing to kind of, tie it all together, we're talking about this idea of getting more opportunity is just like take attempts at something that people are working on. And you gave a pretty good breakdown of thinking about skill work and ways to incorporate it that's a little bit unstructured. If you were to say one thing that's like, hey, listen, here's how you should think about this that kind of avoids some of the pitfalls that people have, like what do you think is the way to approach, getting that muscle up, getting that handstand walk, getting that snatch?
I think what is really important when people start out is sort of setting themselves up for success the majority of the time. And I'm actually going to use an example that I'm actually experiencing myself at the moment. So I started playing rugby again after taking 10 years out. And in my position, I have to pass the ball more than anyone else in the game. And recently, when I've been practicing in training with other people, the only practice I really get to pass the ball is in a game-specific scenario. So I have people running at me and I'm panicking and I'm like throwing shitty passes all the time. So I know that for every crap pass I'm throwing, I have to throw at least, several good passes to sort of cancel it out. And at the moment, I don't necessarily have that opportunity. So now I have to go back and I brought a few balls and I'm now going to be just doing more repetitions and just being like, okay, I need to get 50 passes off of my left-handed day, 25 off of my right-handed day, for the next, several months, whatever it is, until next season. Because I know that if I actually start to accumulate those positive reps and I put that sort of in the bank, you could say, then that is going to set me up for success more so than the situation I'm at right now, where I'm practicing game scenarios. I'm throwing crap passes one after the other. And it's like, I'd say within CrossFit, you have to sort of find where that breaking point is. You need to regress a bit. You need to just build, have those shots on goal when because the idea of shots on goal is the fact that, you are having some element of success with that. You're on goal. So it's trying to figure out where that breaking point is, regress it, build volume, and then progress it and sort of go back and forth in a bit of a structured way, a way which is going to sort of allow for you to make, good, consistent improvement. And this is something that, exists within all training. But I think that there's far too much focus on the actual thing, if that makes sense. It's like, it's the thing, and don't get me wrong, you do need to do the thing, and you do need to, practice under stressful environments and all that stuff. But you need to make sure that you build up a good volume of practice of successful scenarios in order to get there.